This morning, I guess, topic or sermon title is Suffering Well, which I know sounds more like an oxymoron than a truth. Kind of like Jumbo Shrimp and Great Depression, or I think my favorite is Clearly Confused. You know, someone who is clearly confused. And yet then we look at this idea of suffering well, and we go, is that even possible? Can you even do that? And if you could do that, what would it look like? Or in my case, I think sometimes we forget, is this really a biblical principle? That God in His heart towards us, in the midst of all the suffering that we go through, that one of God's greatest desires for us is to learn how to suffer well. And if you suffer well, then what does that mean? What does that actually look like for a person in their suffering to do it well? Does it mean fetal position? And just lay there? Maybe. Sometimes. Does it mean that you smile all the time in your suffering? That there is always this joy and excitement and you're just so excited for everything that comes your way and you can fake it till you make it? No, I don't think so. And so we're going to spend 2 weeks. And there's no way I could hit this topic in 2 weeks. And so this morning it's going to be more of an overview. And then next week I'm going to really look at how you do it. How David did it in Psalm 13. And for those of you who are suffering, let me tell you this. This has probably been the best book that I've read on the idea of suffering well. And so if maybe you're here this morning, you're like, I'm it. I'm in the bottom of suffering. This is where I'm at. Timothy Keller writes a book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Not only does he talk about where suffering comes from in the midst of our lives and how it gets there with sin and Satan and all those things, but he also talks about how to get through it. How to handle it and how to deal with it. And a lot of things you're going to hear this morning, really, I just stole from him. There's no great wisdom that I have. I just literally took it from here and said, we got to hear some of this stuff this morning. Because I think when it comes to suffering, we all recognize we go through it. Jesus talked about this. In John 16, he says, in this world you will have tribulation. Well, like Jesus said, I promise this is coming. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says He sends rain on the just and the unjust, meaning that there's going to be things that come to those who are good and those who are bad. In 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter says, Beloved, do not be surprised by the fiery ordeals. Don't think that what's coming at you is strange. And why do you think it's strange when it's coming at you? In 1 Peter chapter 5, it says, after you have suffered for a little while. Well, this concept of suffering is seen constantly through Scripture, not just here, but you could write these down. In Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, Paul talks about suffering. In Romans chapter 8, verse 35, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 24, in Colossians chapter 1, verse 24, in James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, in Hebrews chapter 12, constantly in Scripture this idea that there is going to be suffering. Because number one, sin has entered the world in Genesis chapter 3. What God intended to be good, man made evil. And because of that evil, sin and death entered in, and we feel the effects of that all the time. You see it this week in New York. Someone wants to take a car and hit people. Because sin entered the world, and man's heart is evil, and we feel the effects of that sin constantly in the midst of our lives. Number one. Number two, because God is going to use suffering for His good and for our glory. Or for His glory and for our good. God is going to use suffering. He promises over and over again that I'm going to allow suffering to take place in your life. And I'm allowing it. I'm letting it in full force for a purpose and for a plan. And sometimes that's hard to deal with because we don't see it. We're honest with each other and say, I don't see how any good comes from that. And that's a legit, honest response for you and me in suffering well. I don't see it, God. I don't see where it's coming. I don't see how it could be good. And yet we know it's for our good. And we know it's for His glory. And because sometimes we got to be honest, we suffer because of our own stuff. We don't want to talk about it, but sometimes we suffer because of our own sin. Hebrews chapter 12 says this, that we are going to suffer sometimes because of our own junk, because of our own past. We suffer. And so it's not that we're not going to suffer. The thing is, what's weird about it is, I think for you and me, the problem with Christianity and as a culture is we take suffering and we belittle it a little bit. Meaning this. A headache becomes suffering. A long line in Walmart is suffering. Right? You're going to go out to lunch today and you're going to have your waiter or waiter not hurry up and you're going to think, man, I'm suffering. Like this week, all 3 of my cars' check engine lights went on in 3 days in a row. And then Shani got a flat in Walmart. I pointed out Shani, like somehow she planned to get the flat. Like she purposely hit the nail to get the flat. And then she calls me and then I have to leave what I'm doing to go down to Walmart to fix the flat. And I get there and the flat, or the spare, is flat. And so I go home and I pump up the spare, and then the jack that I have in the car won't get the car up. So I have to go home and get another jack to lift the car up. An hour and a half later, I got the flat fixed. I come home, I take it the next day to the place to get it fixed, and of course the tire can't be fixed because we drove on it a whole less than a mile, and that's going to cost me another hour and a half, and another $13, and all the time I'm thinking I'm suffering. Like you hear what I just said? One of my 3 cars, all of my 3 cars. Now, I don't have great cars. They all have 180,000 miles and their lights always on. But the point is, I have 3 cars, and I consider it suffering. The spare tire, I consider it suffering. The extra jack is suffering. The time that I have to do it is suffering. Somehow we take that and you look at, let's say, 5th century people where 1 out of every 5 child never made it to their first birthday. Half the kids never made it to 10. And most likely all your kids and family were dead inside your home. That's a different way of suffering. Do you think so? So we take suffering and we belittle it in such a way where the line is suffering, and that's not suffering. So we're so confused in our mind of how to deal with suffering well because we don't even know what suffering is anymore. Because we make it all about us. Or maybe we just do what most do, we just avoid it. Like we've become so detached from it, we didn't know how to deal with it. Like I said, in the 5th century, when you died, you typically died in your home, and so you dealt with death. We avoid death at all cost. Someone comes, picks up the body, takes it to the morgue, and then I call, and I don't have to go in there and look at it if I don't want to. I don't know, so we don't know suffering in a lot of ways. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we don't. Or you don't feel the weight of it, and we don't feel the weight of it. I'm saying is our view of it is really twisted in the midst of life. And so we avoid it at all costs, or we don't avoid it, we minimize it. It's not that big of a deal. And so we minimize our suffering in such a way where we go, it's not that big of a deal, but though inside my heart's dying, I feel empty, I feel alone, I feel scared, I feel all these things, but I minimize it like it's not that big of a deal, which does no way, shape, or form allow me to suffer well. Or maybe I don't do that, maybe I just medicate it. Like that was mine. Before as a Christian, I was a great medicator. Even now that I'm not a Christian, as a Christian, I'm a great medicator. Like maybe not with drugs or alcohol anymore, but I can easily turn on Amazon and watch 14 seasons of something in a row. 16 hours later, drool, like the commercial, chips in my beard, you know, and I can easily medicate just by watching TV in such a way where I don't have to think about what's going on, or I don't have to be that person, or I can be someone else for a while. Or maybe it's not TV, it's porn, or whatever it is, something that's going to drag me away from my suffering, stick me someplace else for a bit. And we buy into it. Or maybe it's not even that. Maybe we know what we do, I think, more than anything else, is a lot of us buy into the fact of this, that because I'm sad, anxious, depressed, there must be something wrong with me. But like somehow there must be something wrong with me mentally because I'm sad, because I'm anxious, because I'm depressed. Or it's not mentally, maybe it's chemically. There's something wrong with me, that's why I'm depressed. And so we buy into this lie that and I'm not saying that there's not time where it is chemical, and I'm not saying there's not time where there isn't something emotional, but I'm saying this, for the most part, we buy into the lie that because I'm sad, because I'm anxious, because I'm depressed, that certainly God doesn't want me to feel this way, so there must be something wrong with me. Or maybe God just wants you to feel that way. You ever thought about that? Maybe God desires you to feel that way for a while and for a time. A.W. Tozer said this. He said, it is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. Now that sounds contrary to everything we've ever heard about God. And yet, Scripture would point us to the fact that it's true. That every person in Scripture has gone through suffering in some form or fashion. Adam and Eve, their own. Then they watched one son kill another son. Noah, there was some suffering. I mean, yeah, he built the ark, but can you imagine, in a sense, the PTSD he went through? I mean, you're talking 120 years, you're building an ark. You're telling your people about the end's coming, the end comes, and all those people come knocking on your door, but the door's closed. I'm sure there's a part of Noah when he gets to the land, he's like, yes, me and my family are here, but he's thinking about his people that never made it. You think there was some suffering and some depression and some longing in Noah's heart? To wonder, why did I find grace with God, but no one else did? You bet. Maybe it's not him, maybe it's Ruth and Naomi. You could lose your husband. You could lose both sons. And you could look at your life and say, I'm bitter. Just change my name. That's who I am. In my very essence of who I am. Or maybe it's not them. Maybe it's Elijah. Here's a guy who had great victory, and all of a sudden he found himself in a cave, and he's crying out to God. And in 1 Kings chapter 19, he cries out and says, God, just kill me. What's the great thing about God is God doesn't kill him. God sends an angel. The angel touches him and says, arise and eat, for your journey is long. You've got a long road ahead, Elijah. And suffering is part of it. It's going to be embedded into every part of life. Or maybe it's not him. Maybe it's Mary. I'm sure when she found out she was pregnant, she was so excited. You go from a wedding one day to you're pregnant the next day, not knowing how, knowing what's coming with it. Or the Apostle Paul, who was stoned, shipwrecked, beaten. But my point is this. Sometimes God allows suffering to come in such a way to get our attention and to hold us close. C.S. Lewis says this, and I like it. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasure. God whispers to us in our pleasure. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain. He whispers in our pleasure. He speaks in our conscience, and yet he shouts to us of who he is in the midst of our pain, because he knows how we feel. See, here's the buy-in, I think. I think most of us, the reason why suffering has become so weird is, let me give you a picture, I think, for you visuals. See, I think most of us buy into this. We live with the American dream. Now, long as it's no longer an American dream, now it's more like a worldly dream. Everyone believes the same way America does, and so we all have the same dream that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is all I'm about. And if anything is contrary to my life, my liberty, and my pursuit of happiness, then it must be suffering. Because I know I deserve my life, I deserve my liberty, and I deserve my happiness. And so if anything comes contrary to that, then it must be suffering. It has to be suffering, because I know that I'm here for this purpose of life, and my liberty, and my freedom, and my happiness, and that's why God's made me, is to be free and to be happy. And if it's contrary to that, then there must be something wrong. And so even the simple flat tire that comes my way, I say, no, it's suffering, get it out. Think about it. This is why your high schooler gets so upset at the fact they can't go somewhere. Listen to your high schoolers, listen to me, this is it. You look at you and you go, you've taken away my happiness. And because you take away my happiness, I can't have it, and I'm suffering because I can't go to the movies. Or I'm suffering, and we laugh at the junior high or the high schooler who goes, oh, I'm suffering. But the parent does the same thing, goes, oh, I'm suffering because my kid won't listen to me. Because you've taken away my happiness. You've taken away what my life is supposed to be, and you're not listening to me, and therefore I'm suffering as a parent. We do this with everything in life. And it all evolves around the same kind of concept. As we think that somehow life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is all what I am about. And we see it all the time. And not only just that, we see it in big things. We see it in marriages, when marriages break up. Because my happiness isn't being fulfilled. It goes on with everything. Do you know in Iceland right now, there is the lowest birth rate of Down syndrome kids. Only 1 or 2 a year is born in Iceland. It's not because they figured something out biologically. It's because of the fact that they do tests to see if your kid is could have Down syndrome. If your kid has Down syndrome, they abort it. So they have 1 or 2 Down syndrome kids a year because they abort the child. No matter how old the child is in the womb, they abort it because it has Down syndrome. And here's in the article, this was just in August 17, 2017. I got this article. This lady, whose name is Helga, she's a counselor for those women who are aborting their children. Here's what she says. She says, I tell these moms this is your life. You have the right to choose your life, what it looks like. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You could do what you want to do. It's your life. We don't look at abortion as murder. We look at it as a thing that is ending. What's ending? She says this, we ended a possible life that may have had a huge complication. Heaven forbid we'd have complication in our life. And then goes on, preventing suffering from the child and for the family. I think this is the right thing to do. It's not murder. Do you see what she just did? She took this idea and said, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. If it doesn't fit in there, then I have to get rid of it because it can't be good. But what if, I say this, what if that's actually the opposite as a Christian? What if my life isn't my life? What if my life is Christ's life? What if when I became born again, I was bought with a price and therefore I'm no longer mine, but I'm His? What if that's my view of my life? What if I know that I'm created for it to be an image bearer of Him? That grace and truth should be part of who I am, and that I should lack nothing. And therefore, whatever God allows in my life must have a purpose for that life. That changes my view of suffering altogether, does it not? If I view myself not as me, but as Christ in me, and whatever God wants to allow to come to me, then I must receive that and take that and trust that God's going to work it out, again, for my good and for His glory. That changes everything. Does it not? But when you're about you in your life, then it doesn't change much. No, here's the rub. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we should go look for suffering. Right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm saying that God, when He allows suffering to come, it has a purpose and a plan in it, no matter how hard it is. And it's because He wants to make me more in the image of who He is. And so I allow that suffering. I don't avoid that suffering. I don't avoid that conversation. I don't avoid the hard things. I allow the hard things to come, knowing that He's going to produce something in them, but I don't go look for them. Right? People have tried that throughout centuries. That's just working your way back to God. I'm not looking to suffer. That's why the Bible says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. If you're in a rejoicing time in your life and you go, yes, things are good. If you're in a suffering time, you say, yes, things are bad. There's a heart and a hurt in the midst of it. See, here's the thing. I think, number one, we need to change our view of what suffering is. We've gotten it twisted. The line at Walmart isn't suffering. The flat tire isn't suffering. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it doesn't feel like it at times, but it's not. You've got to learn how to speak truth to yourself and say, that's not suffering. And then the reality is, we need to see that when I do suffer, how do I do it well then? And again, we'll talk about this next week more so. This morning is just more of an overview. I want you to see why it's important for us to understand where it comes from and where the enemy sits. But thirdly, I think we need to recognize that Christ suffered. Just when we have communion, it's one of the greatest chances for you and I to remember that we have a high priest who can sympathize with my suffering. Understand this, not only sympathize, but our suffering, hear me, for some of you, this may be the first thought you ever thought about this. Our suffering is never punitive. Listen to me, if you ever hear someone say, you've lost this or God's doing this to you because of your sin, God does not punitively pour His anger or wrath on me ever as a Christian. Does He discipline me? Yes. But it's never out of anger and out of wrath. That anger and wrath has been put on the cross, and so we have the cross to remind us that our suffering is never punitive. God is never trying to get back at me. God is purposely never trying to do something to me or to harm me or to catch me. Does He want to discipline me? Yes. To draw me back to Him? Yes. But it's never out of wrath or anger. That's been paid for on the cross. That's what the cross is all about, that Jesus has taken that wrath. He's taken that anger. So I don't have to worry. Does that make sense? I don't want us to think that somehow that's the case, that when God's wrath is poured out, it's never towards us. It's always in there. And yet, we have this hope that in Isaiah chapter 53 it says, he who's despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with much grief. I love that idea that Jesus was acquainted with grief. Well, like he knew what it felt like. Like we've all been there before where you've talked to someone who's, maybe you go and someone has something going on really hard and you go to talk to them and you have no clue what they're going through. Like you have no clue how to connect because you just can't. That never happens with Jesus. Like he's acquainted with it. He knows about it for him. He knows what exactly you're going through and how it feels in the midst of it. This is why we can trust it. This is why one of the reasons in the midst of our suffering, we can trust it. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to go through Psalm 22 real quick, and I want us just to see why I can trust Christ in my suffering. And then I want to get us ready for communion as we take it. And so Psalm 22, it's a messianic psalm. It's a psalm about Jesus, like Psalm 2, Psalm 20, Psalm 72, and Psalm 10, if you're taking notes, or psalms about Jesus. It's written 1,000 years before Jesus. In there, it is still a prayer of David, though it's talking, as you're going to see, about Christ. Remember, in the New Testament, anytime you read about Jesus' death, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, do you ever notice there's not much detail? Like, no one, have you ever seen the movie Passion of the Christ? Like, you watch the movie Passion of the Christ, you're like, dang, that's a brutal death. You read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's like, and Jesus was flogged. And they nailed his hands to the cross. But you watch the movie, and you hear the sounds of it, and you get a biblical, well, that never takes place in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Probably because, again, by the time this time in history, there's over 100,000 crucifixions. It wasn't like anyone said, hey, there's a crucifixion, I'm going to tell you how it went today. Oh, I saw that yesterday. I saw that last week. And yet, Psalm 22 probably gives us one of the greatest, in a sense, pictures visually of what happened with Jesus on the cross. His pain and his grief, both physically and mentally. It starts out in Psalm 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? From the deliverance of the words of my groaning, oh my God, cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but you have no rest. If you know your Bible, you know this is the same quote Jesus, it's his fourth saying on the cross when he cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's seen in Matthew and in Mark. It's a real, legit forsaken. But like, notice what Jesus says here. On the cross, he says, my God. It's the only time ever Jesus calls God, God. Every time else, he calls him what? Father. Because there's a legit forsaking. There's a legit separation from him. I mean, think about this. And this is what marked my mind this week. And I don't want to say think about this, but okay, you all have been to a place in your life where you felt totally separated from somebody. Someone died, someone left. And you've all been to a spot where you can feel the gravity of that loss. Whatever it meant for you. The crying, the weeping, the whatever it was. Now, fast forward that. Now, magnify that by 1 billion. Think about this. Jesus had always known the Father from eternity past. Like there wasn't a time in Jesus' life when he did not know who God was, when he was not connected to God the Father. In one mind, in one purpose, and everything. And then all of a sudden, when he takes on our sin, that separates from the Father. Like you talk about our hurt and our pain of people we've known for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. And the depth of our pain. Can you imagine the depth of Christ and the separation from God the Father when from eternity he had known him? So when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's a legit wondering and longing and loneliness that's taken place. It's not just a cool quote. So you can stick it in the Old Testament and New Testament. There's a legit separation which Jesus felt from him at that time. And yet, someone once said this, and for those of you who may be in this spot right now where you're lost and you're suffering, someone said this, a cry of distress is not always a cry of distrust. A cry of distress is not always a cry of distrust. We'll see that next week in Psalm 13 when we start to learn how to suffer well. But one of the ways to suffer well is to learn how to just call it in distress. To be honest with where you're at in your heart and your soul and your mind with who God is. To be honest there and say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why does it feel like you never talk to me? Why do I feel so alone and empty in the midst of who you are? What's great about this, and in Luke 22, remember Jesus' last words on the cross? Do you remember them? He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It changed in the midst of it. There was a cry of, my God, my God. If you look at verse 6 in Psalm 22, he says, but I'm a worm, not a man of reproach of men. Again, Jesus' picture here is a worm. He's lower than man. What's cool about this word worm, it's the same word seen in Isaiah chapter 1 and in Exodus chapter 25, the scarlet worm they call it. This worm would crawl on a tree and lay its babies. And then the worm would die and the babies would live. But the tree where the mark where the worm was at would turn red. Like Jesus has given us a picture of what he would do on the cross. And he would die for us. The scarlet there. Go to verse 11. Verse 11, let's bring it up. It says, do not be far off from me, for in trouble is near, for there is none who help. Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls at base encircle me. They've opened wide the mouth of me and ravaging a roaring lion. They are pouring out like water and bones out of my joint. My heart is like wax, is melted within me. My strength is dried up as a potsherd. My tongue cleaves to my jaws, and they lie in the dust of death. The dogs have surrounded me. The band of evildoers encompass me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I count them all my bones. I look and they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and from my clothing they cast lots. Notice first in verse 11, I got to learn a new word this week. I always love when I get new words. Zoomorphism. You guys ever heard of zoomorphism? It's when a writer will take an animal and then equate it to a person. This is what Jesus does here, and in a sense what David does and relying to what happened to Jesus. He says they were like bulls, they were like, in verse 12 and in verse 13, they're like lions, they're like dogs. He's given a picture of what's going on around him. In verse 15, he says, my strength is dried up like potsherd, meaning there's nothing left in him while he hangs on the cross. My tongue cleaves to my jaw. There's a dryness not only in his soul but in his body as he's on the cross. In verse 16, again, his bones are on display, meaning more than likely Jesus was naked on the cross and everyone's there watching, despising what's going on. They're staring at him, not out of concern or care, but hoping just to watch this man die for it. He says that they gloat over me. They cast, again, they pierce my hands and my feet, and they divide my garments among them. I think, again, when it comes to the cross, one of the greatest things we have in it is that we have, a high priest who can sympathize with our suffering. See, one of the ways to suffer well is to realize that we have someone that can suffer well with us, that is able to come along and to suffer well because he has suffered for us. That's the gospel. That our suffering isn't punitive, that our suffering is because he's working something out in us. Does that make sense?